Welcome back to the panel discussion, Moving Agency Applications to the Cloud with Platform as a Service, sponsored by Red Hat and Carahsoft on federalnewsradio.com and 1500 AM. I'm your moderator, Jason Miller. Our guests today are Frank Konechny, the Chief Technology Officer in the Air Force's Office of Information Dominance and Chief Information Officer, Daniel Massey, a Program Manager in the Cybersecurity Division in the Homeland Security Department's Science and Technology Directorate, and Joel Jackson, the Director of Middleware and Cloud Sales at Red Hat Federal. Now, gentlemen, before break, we were talking a lot about not just security, but the idea of moving from legacy apps to the cloud and the middleware piece that in there. There's also another piece to this, and we're going to hit upon both the DevOps in this section, but also the business side. So let me turn to Frank first and start with the business needs, because this is the key, I think, to all of this. You can rationalize all your apps, but if the business people aren't going to use it, then that shadow IT can sneak back in potentially, or they feel like the CIO is not supporting their needs. So from a business perspective, your setup of the program managers, that's fairly new. Do I have that right?
It's fairly new. It started in October, this month. I mean, we talked about it for a couple months already before that and planning for it, but it's starting really in October with the new fiscal year. And the way it's organized is that the missionary integrators actually work with the program managers and the user community. And they do it, we established another organization called the Managed Service Office. And the Managed Service Office is the engineering view of the support that we need. We use them to determine what platform would be best for them. We also have a team of people who will actually help them migrate their application into the environment and test it for them and with them. And so we are doing everything we can basically to shepherd them along into the right environment. And between that and controlling the portfolio, that's probably the best way to get them there. Because we always had the problem. You could put out a directive and say you must go there. But unless you actually support what they're doing and making sure that it gets there, it's very difficult for them to go there.
Did you end up having to either hire new people, which I know is maybe a semi-dirty word in government, hiring people is always tough, or did you have people that need to be retrained to do this mission support?
We had people who were retrained.
Because I think that's one of the toughest things is to change that perspective. When I talk to CIOs often, they always talk about how they're becoming more customer service focused and customer centric instead of just being the tech people. And I think this is a great example of you guys heading in that direction as well.
Yes, we're heading towards a more customer oriented, making sure that the mission gets done by the customer. And then we talked about the operational community and everything else. Yes, we have to be involved in the operational community because we've done many things of delivering systems out there that don't really work in the operation environment.
And that's when people have this bad look at both technology and federal procurement, I think, is when bad things like that happen. Let me turn to Daniel over at Homeland Security. One of the things that we talked a lot about was, just kind of play off of what Frank said, was not just the business side, but there's a whole new set of communities that are kind of coming together, working together. Talk a little bit about how the DevOps, we talked about, and now the test and evaluation group, how they all have to kind of come closer together when you talk about moving to platform as a service.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's very true, and we are seeing more of this convergence of the group. So it's not an isolated world where we've got the testing, which is separate from the deployment, which is and so forth. Right? We in the R&D community, right? One of our missions is to sort of connect some of the more cutting edge R&D solutions with the customer needs inside the federal government, and one of our biggest challenges there is just the difference between the community views. And so you may have a tremendously smart, tremendously agile group that's coming in with what they believe is the greatest software package ever, right, or the greatest app ever, and they're encountering maybe sometimes for the first time to them a very confusing and baffling bureaucracy of how do I even talk to these folks? I mean, I showed them the app, they can download it. Why isn't it up on the system now? And of course, the federal people are looking at that and saying, no, the odds of you walking into this meeting and walking out with your tool deployed, on any of our systems is effectively zero. And how do you get those guys to meet in the middle? And that's been one of the things we're trying to do. And some of the ways we try to do that is by just bringing the folks together, trying to get documents out that convey an understanding back and forth, so the federal people don't come in and feel like these guys are not willing to work with us. They won't listen to any regulation. They want to just develop and go, and the developers don't feel like we're just being told, it's a stone wall and there's no way in, and the legacy players entrenched, and we'll never move them out.
Joe.
Right. I think you're hitting on an interesting topic too about how does the federal space and the development community in that world interface with the open source communities and all these cool technologies that are coming out there. I mean, if you look at NSA, I think you see them show up at these OpenStack conferences, for example, and present. You see many other federal agencies also go to, NoSQL conferences and stuff like that. So I think the more you can remove the barriers for letting your developers integrate with those open source communities, I think the better, because you can actually we actually work with NSA on this project called SE Linux, where you get the secure piece of the Linux kernel built with Red Hat's help. We were the ambassador for them inside the open source community. So there's a variety of ways you can do that, but I agree. The more you can remove the barriers on getting your team working with the open source community, especially the upstream community, where they're really doing some of the cutting edge stuff, the better and more likely it'll get into production.
Joel, let me throw a follow-up as well, because when you talk about different communities, when it comes to and I kind of know the answer to this, but I'll let you kind of talk through it a little bit. When it comes to open source, does that open the door and make it easier for communities to kind of see each other's point of view, understand it, and then work together? Because if they're working in a, pick on, XYZ environment, and I'm not really in that X, Y, and Z environment, so I don't understand why you don't get that kind of pushback or that at least tension.
I think depending on the agency, there's a palatable level of participation, I think, depending on each agency. When you we just shared the NSA example, the Navy DDG program, I think it was about 8 years ago, they wanted to do a joint development with an open source community, but they didn't really know how to do that. It was us and Raytheon and IBM. And so we built a custom kernel, a real-time kernel for them that ended up making it into the open source community. And the interesting part about that is when you make these custom things for a federal space or any other market, it actually ends up being used by commercial. So now the real-time operating system that we built for the Navy DDG is now being used by Morgan Stanley, who's updating that, and then the innovation just continues for quite a long time.
Daniel.
Yeah, and I think that's a tremendously important point. I mean, we've been talking a lot about getting the open source into the government, but I think those are some great examples of actually the results flowing the other way, and that's equally important, where government R&D, government results then flow back out to the open source community and get used. And from a DHS perspective, that's actually a huge part of the mission, right? So not only do we need to make sure that our infrastructure is secure, but we are heavily dependent on on a number of critical sectors that we don't run, we don't operate, and to the extent that we can get, the SE, some of the examples that were just mentioned, those actually benefit then the private industry, which increases the security there, and in the best case, you get this great loop where they can then further refine those, right. And I bet some of those improvements then circle back into future government releases.
It's innovation at scale that you just almost can't pay for, right? So Google has security problems. JP Morgan has security problems. Everyone's got security problems. So when you get into the open source community, you find out that we have a lot of the same shared problems, and you can go to work on solving those in a unique way that you normally wouldn't be able to do in the federal space.
Frank, let me turn back to you for a second. When you guys, the Air Force, and you have the security concerns, you talked about, you have the apps rationalization process ongoing. Talk a little bit about the open source piece. Are you guys, when you guys bring in the open source piece, you said they have to go through the DoD security guidelines, the STIG. Where does that role play in terms of your apps rationalization and all the steps you're taking around it?
Remember, DoD is risk adverse.
Exactly.
Because it connects to the internet and everything else, and foreign partners and a bunch of other people. So therefore, you find that DoD wants to make sure everything is secure very well. And so when we bring in open source, we have to go through the process of validating that it's still secure, even though innovation. The problem is innovation occurs really fast in the open source arena, and however, the security processing is not that fast, to say the least. So we may be looking at a version, which is three iterations, 4 iterations behind what's currently out in the field, just because we can't go fast enough to actually do the security evaluation of that next version. And then that's where I think the problem occurs with us, is that we want to use open source. It's not that. It's just that it has to be secure and it just takes a while to get there.
And that's where, Daniel, you got to come in. Are you solving Frank's problem here? What kind of research do you have? You talked about hosts a little bit. Are there other challenges?
So yeah, in fact, we're very in tune with that challenge. And so there's a DHS program recently started up called SWAMP, which is the Software Assurance Marketplace.
Real quick, you guys have the best names. Host, SWAMP.
Host, SWAMP, exactly. We spend a lot of time on that. So the SWAMP is actually intended to sort of help speed up this process for both the users and the developers, right? Because, like I said, it is a challenge to sort of say, well, we can't just roll to this next version. There's several steps that not only should be gone through, but need to be gone through, and they're in this rush to add the great new feature and to make this thing, you cannot overlook that, and you'll create real problems if you do. So SWAMP is a DHS S&T funded program that's bringing together a number of ways to sort of do security validation. It won't get you as far as getting a CNA. Certainly DoD would never look at that and say, based on that, we CNA a result. But it helps bridge that gap, and it helps get you started there. And I think even more important, it helps the developers identify, this is what people might be looking for, grease the skids a little bit for the later processes. And SWAMP is out there. Anybody can run code through SWAMP. And we're pushing now for, if we have a DHS-funded R&D project, that we will actually require them to run their code through the SWAMP and see what happens in the end.
See if it comes out clean on the other end.
Exactly.
Is that the idea?
So go through the SWAMP, see if it comes out of the SWAMP clean.
No leeches or anything. Joe, from your perspective, is that a big challenge for you guys when you go into agencies? Or are they? We love open source, but
I think 10 years ago it was like that. I think it was a very tough market back then. Now it's, when you opened it, you were surprised at how many, I think when you said Googled open source and cloud, it's just not that big a deal anymore, right? It's open source is so pervasive. You see franchises like Google and, the banking community and e-commerce community, they don't use proprietary software for their infrastructure. Their default infrastructure is open. So I don't think it's as big as a deal as it was in the past, but, quite frankly, that's why we're in business, right? We make open source consumable and enterprise grade. We slow down the releases. We make sure you're not on the bleeding edge, right? We make sure if you are looking at a bleeding edge component, we bring that in-house. So we can act as ambassadors for customers, and we also provide these enterprise-grade software
do
packages.
agencies understand that piece? Not that what you do, of course, but the fact is that there's been some safety built into open source.
I think there's still some naiveness that I can just download a package off the internet, and this was a package that Google used, for example. Now I'm going to use it. I think there's still some naiveness around that, but I think in general, most customers understand that open source. There's this huge community out there that moves very, very, very quickly. And then there's the enterprise players like Red Hat that are taking the best of breed and making those into consumable enterprise platforms.
Daniel, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I just want to add, I think that is that's a real critical bridge, right? Because I think you can find that right mix. And, we don't want to stay on the very bleeding edge. It's just not an appropriate place to be.
Shaking his head because it was on the radio right now.
I mean, that's not an enterprise best practice, right?
Exactly.
Edge, right?
And and so you do need to find that nice middle ground. And I also agree that, I think there is more understanding that open source is no longer this sort of strange anomaly, right? As you were mentioning, several major industrial players are rely essentially entirely on that space, and it's a good thing for the government to get. And I think the government is getting more comfortable with. We're finding fewer times when we go in and talk to people and they say open source, we can never touch that. Now we're at least to that next level where open source, we have the following concerns. Can we address these? And often you can. And it's great to have a sort of player like you guys that play that great role to buffer the two communities.
We're almost out of time, so let's do the getaway question. I always love asking this. Frank, Air Force, apps rationalization, cloud, platform as a service, what are you going to look like in 3-5 years from now from the Air Force perspective?
Oh, we're going to rationalize all of our applications.
No, really, Frank.
No, really. Well, we're progressing down the path really fairly rapidly now. As soon as we get the DoD cloud security model finalized, which should happen within a couple months or so, we'll be moving out to commercial clouds as well as DoD clouds. And in fact, we'll have our own clouds at bases. So we're basically moving towards that right now, with platform as a service being the main emphasis that we're going to standardize across the board.
Joel, from your perspective, when you're talking about agency customers, what's it going to look like from an open source perspective? Obviously, we all know everyone using Red Hat, but let's put that to the side for a second. What's it going to look like in terms of cloud and
Well, I think when you look over to the commercial field and you see all the innovation happening in the cloud infrastructure, from Hadoop to Linux to NoSQL, those are all key components of the cloud infrastructure. None of those were developed by companies. They were all developed in open source communities for large companies that were just solving problems, and they open sourced those. And now, customers like the federal government can take advantage of those. So I see that trend continuing, where a lot of the open source community develops, pushes out very interesting, innovative products, and we'll be here to make those enterprise ready platforms for our customers.
All right, and Daniel Massey of Homeland Security, get the last word. About 30 seconds on cloud security.
Right, and in terms of open source, we see open source as becoming the default for R&D. And if you're DHS Science and Technology funded R&D program, our default option is open source. You can certainly go other ways, but the preferred method is to do something open source and go with that.
And go through the swamp. I love your acronyms. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today. You've been listening to the panel discussion, Moving Agency Applications to the Cloud with Platform as a Service, sponsored by Red Hat and Carahsoft on federalnewsradio.com and 1500 AM. I'm your host, Jason Miller. I'd like to thank our guests today, Frank Konechny, the Chief Technology Officer in the Air Force's Office of Information Dominance and Chief Information Officer, Daniel Massey, a Program Manager in the Cybersecurity Division of the Homeland Security Department's Science and Technology Directorate, and Joel Jackson, the Director of Middleware and Cloud Sales at Red Hat Federal. If you'd like to view this discussion on demand, please visit federalnewsradio.com and search PASS.
On behalf of Red Hat and Carahsoft, thank you for joining our discussion. We'll have the archive from this session available shortly, and a link will be sent to you to share with your colleagues. Those of you who requested a training certificate for this webinar should receive it in the next 2 weeks. This concludes today's webinar. Thank you.